Metaphors are everywhere. We say that our memory is cloudy, that we are feeling blue. A region might be called a melting pot and a candidate a dark horse. When we use metaphors like the ones in these examples, we establish similarity between an approachable concept and a more complex one. In doing so, we aim to make the more complex concept approachable. Sporting metaphors for elections, as the label suggests, establish similarity between aspects of sporting events and components of elections. However, these metaphors can have a pernicious effect on the way we think about elections. My name is Isaac Martin Bozzi Hoeh, and in this thesis I answer the questions: when and why did these metaphors begin to circulate in the United States? And how do they affect the way we think and act around elections and democracy more broadly? I initially hypothesized that the rise in the popularity of public opinion polling in the 1930s led to the emergence of sporting metaphors for elections. To test this hypothesis, I looked for the earliest examples of sporting metaphors for elections in the United States. And after digging through the accessible archives, I found that these metaphors actually arose 100 years before public opinion polling, thus indicating that public opinion polling did not lead to the use of sporting metaphors. Instead, I found that the metaphors emerged in the 1800s. In this slide, we see the 5 earliest sporting metaphors for elections in the United States that I found, along with the year and publication in which they first appeared. If we look to the left-hand column, we see the metaphors in italics. As you will notice, all of these earliest sporting metaphors for elections use terminology drawn from horse racing. In other words, horse racing metaphors for elections were the first sporting metaphors for elections to appear in the United States, with the first example being election as a race in 1826. And this makes historical sense. Horse racing was, to quote one historian, America's first pastime. More specifically, it was the most popular sport in the United States until at least the 1890s, when boxing was legalized. And the popularity of horse racing during the 1820s explains why horse racing metaphors for elections started to appear in that period. But what do these metaphors do? I mentioned that the use of these metaphors has pernicious effects. To get a sense of this process, let us consider the earliest sporting metaphor that I found in my research. In this 1826 column, the unnamed author writes, "My friends, suppose John Adams had been re-elected in 1800 to 1801. Suppose the New York election, which race we won by the throat latch and Aaron Burr's jockeyship, had gone against us." In characterizing the 1800 presidential election, he employs the 3 highlighted metaphors drawing on horse racing to characterize the 1800 election, with race and jockeyship clearly derived from horse racing, and throat latch referring to a piece of a horse's bridle. In this election, Thomas Jefferson beat John Adams. Aaron Burr, a member of Jefferson's party, helped Jefferson win the presidency by leading their party in the state of New York. In fact, Burr was elected vice president in the same election. However, beyond Burr, Jefferson, and Adams, there were a number of important historical conditions which contributed to Jefferson's election. This slide highlights a few of the things that impacted the outcome of the election. For instance, according to the voting laws of the time, only white men of certain financial standing were allowed to vote. And even then, due to ill-defined rules governing the Electoral College and the popular vote, the president ended up being selected by Congress, a process involving bargaining between party officials. In other words, a small group of white men elected an even smaller group of white men who decided which candidate would assume the presidency. However, many of these components are deeply nuanced, and horse racing is a rather simple sport. So when the author uses horse racing metaphors to frame this complicated election, he only highlights the simple aspects of the election, the ones that correspond with horse racing. Thus, the metaphorical image of the election as a horse race shows only a few parts of the election. All the other more complicated components are hidden. What we are left with is a picture of the 1800 election created by the metaphors, which only includes the components of the election which fit the small image of horse racing. This image illuminates individual actors and the drama of campaigning. But of course, this is an incomplete picture of the 1800 presidential election. When we return to the hidden components of the election, we see a process marred by undemocratic practices. In fact, it would seem, after looking at these hidden practices, that Jefferson did not win the presidency due to Burr or his own political skill or strength, but because of a deeply exclusive and undemocratic process. In other words, the election of 1800 was undemocratic. And crucially, the horse racing metaphors for elections allowed the author to paint a highly simplified portrait of the election which hid these components. In other words, the metaphors hid the undemocracy of the 1800 presidential election. And moving from the 1800s to the present election discourse, these metaphors continue to highlight a simplified version of elections and hide substantive components, albeit now the metaphors are more subtle. Consider the Fox News 2020 election results webpage. Here, the metaphor race appears not only on the front page as circled, but throughout their coverage and that of many other news sources, including the New York Times, NBC, ABC, CNN, and others. Even the visual depiction of the candidates in opposition to each other, with nothing but vote totals and party identification to contextualize the competition, conveys a racing-esque image. In particular, the layout of the website fits the simplified image of the election as a race metaphor. There is no policy debate or campaign finance discussion or a discussion of what is at stake in the election, just the apparent facts of the competition itself, who is leading and who is trailing, and to which party they belong. It creates a sense of intense competition in which Biden and Trump might be jockeys or horses competing for the win. Now, while this image is highly hyperbolic, it emphasizes the way metaphors shape our thought. In a sport with only a few visible actors, horses and jockeys, there is no room for the complicated webs of power which are at work in an election. The metaphors make the candidates horses or jockeys, and the vote margins between the two major candidates are reduced to the time difference between the winning horse and the second place one. Here, we see some of the many components of the 2020 presidential election and the metaphor election as a race. The election as race metaphor highlights the competitive aspects of the election, the partisan rivalry, winning and losing, and attributes of the individual candidates. These are the only aspects of the election made visible by the metaphor. When we hide all these other non-highlighted aspects of the election, we pay less attention to them. We pay less attention to campaign finance, the fact that voters are forced to choose between two corporate parties, and voter suppression. And all these hidden features of contemporary elections are certainly in need of inspection if we wish to democratize our institutions. While in the 1800s these metaphors were somewhat conspicuous, as seen in the 1826 example, they are now embedded in our language. If race had not been circled on this screen, I am willing to bet that you would not have noticed that these are horse racing metaphors. But even though they are more subtle, they are no less impactful on the way we think about elections. By hiding the complicated aspects of elections, we not only oversimplify them, but hide some parts of elections that may be undemocratic. If we wish to democratize our elections, or think about ways of conceiving of democracy beyond elections, we must first bring these metaphors to the surface, as we have done here today. And then we must reckon with our elections as seen without sporting metaphors. In other words, do we like what we see when we look at the webs of power which lead to electoral outcomes? In doing so, we must create a new language of politics that reflects what we want from our political discourse. Whether that consists of a new type of metaphor, a new, more democratic metaphor, or something else remains to be seen. However, if we wish to democratize our politics and elections, we must expose and fix the ways our political imagination is constrained by language.